Now we will switch to English, and I will introduce André Teixeira. Sorry for I haven't mastered pronouncing your surname yet, but I will just mention that 1 or 2 weeks ago, André hosted a workshop on cybersecurity. And if I'm not misinformed, all those presentations are also available on the web. Maybe André can put the link in the chat to that if anybody's interested to hear more. But we will get an introduction to the topic from André here. So welcome.
Thank you. I can share the link when I'm done with the talk. Yes, for sure. Yeah. So give me some feedback. Do you all see my presentation slide, the title slide? Looks fine. Yeah, and if I move, you can see the animation happening. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, then let's go. Yeah, so thank you, Matthias, for inviting me to give this short talk. And as Matthias said, it will be a very short introduction to the topic and trying to make some connections to safety, risk management, and highlight some differences. First, we'll talk a bit about the typical vulnerabilities in industrial control systems. And before we go there, I just wanted to highlight here what is a typical structure of an industrial control system. So what you have here is a typical setup where you have a physical process that you want to control. So it can be a robotic arm, it can be a nuclear reactor, it can be an energy grid. And you want to control that physical process through some kind of information technology infrastructure. And in the context of control systems, that's typically done through what's called a SCADA system, a supervisory control and data acquisition system, where you have essentially sensors and actuators that are connected to the physical devices, and they are the ones collecting information and acting on the physical process to change its behavior. And then you have locally programmable logical controllers that have low-level control algorithms, if you want, to, based on the sensor data, act on the actuators. And they may have communication capabilities, so they might be able to communicate through cellular networks, wired cables to the control center. And at the control center, you typically have human operators interfacing the systems through workstations or human-machine interfaces, but also dedicated servers that record historical data, and they can provide decision support to the human operators. And there's also often the need to interact with corporate IT systems to exchange information, receive new indications on what should be the operation of the system, and also communication with external networks. So the fact that we are operating on this physical process through an IT system brings some security concerns to this kind of systems. And that's further amplified by the lack of security in typical industrial control systems. So these systems, they are legacy systems. They have long life cycles. So many of the systems that we have running now, they were implemented at a time where security was not at a first thought of the engineers implementing the system. So there's a lack of typical security measures, like there's a lack of antivirus or intrusion detection schemes. USB ports in many of the critical assets here are accessible to people that are physically present in the rooms. The communication links also lack basic security features, so there's typically no encryption and no authentication, or strong authentication at least. And in regards to physical processes like energy grids, the PLCs and RTUs are easily accessible once you get into the premises of the substation, and those are not very well guarded usually. And then in addition to all of this, there's also a lot of vulnerabilities that we don't yet know that are present in the software of the systems, and that we call zero-day vulnerabilities. And those can be exploited by malicious adversaries to, in essence, enter into the system, get hold of some sensors or controllers, and then affect the physical behavior of the system. So one classical example by now of this, a real-world malware that did exactly this, is the Stuxnet Malware that was discovered in 2010, and you have here the reference to an article explaining how it worked. Essentially, it targeted a very specific combination of software and devices that were controlling actuators that changed the speed of centrifuges. And it's known that it exploited what were at the time 4 zero-day vulnerabilities. And just to give you a sense, a zero-day vulnerability is something that can be quite expensive to acquire in the black market. So the fact that they had a hold of not only 1 but 4 is indicator of how complex and this attack was. So the speculated goal was that this malware was targeted to essentially damage the centrifuges at some uranium enrichment facilities in Iran. And the attack mode was essentially to prepare this malware based on detailed knowledge of how the system worked, load it in a USB stick, so that when the USB stick would be plugged into the computer, it would start propagating, so no internet connection was necessary. Once the malware propagated and found the target device, it would record and then replay measurements to the control center, while at the same time sending harmful commands to the centrifuges, making their speed vary quite fast and therefore damaging those. So this sets a bit the tone for what we are concerned about in terms of cybersecurity and control systems. So as we see more and more IT infrastructures being embedded in control systems, we then see that many more attack points are being added, and we are interested in ensuring the security and safety of the physical plant. So typical questions that we want to address is what threats should we care about, what impacts can we expect from the attacks, and what resources should we protect more. And that's a typical set of questions that are present in the framework of risk management. So risk management is quite well used in information security as well. So I list here 2 standards that are related to information security and risk management in general. I expect that you have seen some form of the risk management process in one way or another. So in security, the idea is very similar conceptually to safety risk management. So we can also use similar tools to assess, for instance, likelihoods. So in security, we use attack graphs. In safety, one would use fault trees to understand how low-level events can reach more high-level consequences. But there's a different main focus where in information security, we are interested in the information system assets and in malicious adversaries. And that's a very big distinction to more normal safety risk management. And that also brings some changes to the concept of risk that we use in security analysis. So typically risk has these 3 elements. So a given scenario, its likelihood and its impact. Many of the questions are similar to safety and security. So what is the system that we are working with? What is the kind of adversary? What can it do? What vulnerabilities might be exploited and extracted? So trying to characterize the playing field. Then in terms of the impact, that might be related to what security properties were violated, what were the consequences on the operational part of the system, but also in terms of financial safety kind of consequences, and what services in the IT infrastructure were interrupted as well. That's, I would say, quite similar to safety as well. One thing that is quite different is the likelihood of the attack. So typically in safety risk, likelihood is understood as the probability of some event happening. But now when we come into an attack that is malicious, probability is no longer a very good way of describing the likelihood of an attack. And I'll give an example soon about this. So instead, what can be thought of as proxies or factors affecting the likelihood is, okay, what is the required knowledge of the adversary? What are the capabilities that an adversary needs to have in order to successfully conduct an attack? And you can map this to the Stuxnet example that it required 4 zero-day vulnerabilities, so quite a high level of expertise. Then, of course, we are interested in populating the different scenarios with risk, identify what are the critical scenarios, and then deploy protection measures to prevent or then in other ways mitigate them. So I'll end with a brief example of how likelihood can be understood in security and how it can be different from safety analysis. So in security, the likelihood of a given attack being successful is highly dependent on the infrastructure of the information and communication systems. So if I bring you back to the industrial control system, where we now have an energy grid that we want to operate, and we are receiving sensor data and controlling some generators with this control center. then the adversary, a cyber adversary that wants to have an impact on the physical system, needs to go through some of this infrastructure in order to reach and control some of those RTUs. So the different steps that a successful attack need to have is, well, assuming that the attack sits somewhere at the external network, it needs to be able to do some kind of initial infection, for instance, by doing some phishing attack or social engineering and getting access to email and login credentials. Then once the malware is planted using those credentials, the malware needs to disseminate itself and navigate through the infrastructure. So what is the probability that it's able to do this and so on also affects the likelihood. It needs to, in the end, find the target devices, take hold of those devices, and then allow the attacker through this command infrastructure be able to access it and be able to tamper with its information and its knowledge. Its operation. So in essence, what I want to contrast here is that the likelihood metric is typically understood as the probability of successful attack, but this probability in security is hard to compute, let's say. Part of it is because there's no historical data regarding attacks and how they can evolve in these infrastructures. Part of it has to do with the malicious nature of the attack. So it's nothing probabilistic, it has an intent and is adaptive. So as an alternative in security risk analysis, one often uses proxy metrics that are somehow contributing to the likelihood of attacks, and that can be, for instance, number of vulnerability exploited in this kind of attack. I'll jump a bit over this one because we are a bit short on time. I just wanted to make a case that for cybersecurity, we often need to integrate security perspectives and safety perspectives and make a combination of those, because essentially attacks have characteristics that are common to both, but also distinct from any single one of them. So in essence here, the interaction between the physical and the cyber makes it different from classical IT systems. The fact that malicious attackers have an intent and can act strategically is also quite different from what's usually considered in safety risk analysis. So just some final thoughts as food for thought. Security and cybersecurity in particular is different from safety. This can be sometimes hard to get in some languages, like in Swedish and in Portuguese. We use the same words for both ideas. And integration of safety and security is necessary, but it's often challenging because they have different perspectives. They look at different parts of the system, and they can sometimes have contradicting recommendations. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand.
Thank you, André. Very interesting. Do we have any quick question? We're quite sharp on time here, so if anybody has anything. I have 100 questions, but we'll see what. Leave the room for others.
I have a very short comment. Thank you, André. There is actually a Swedish word for security. It's sekuritet, but it's not very common.
Okay, I've not come across that one, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Fysiskt skydd is another word used, but it's only for certain things. So thank you very much, André.